Hello, everyone, and welcome to BPLS's first ever webinar. I'd like to say the first of many, and I'm joined today by an esteemed panel. I think it's important that I do a little introduction to everyone that's going to be at the session today, because not everybody knows who BPLS is and what today's session is going to be about. So BPLS stands for Black Protest Legal Support. We are a recent grassroots group that's set up to support the Black Lives Matter movement. So we currently provide legal observers, provide possible pro bono support if need be, and we also, make it known what's going to happen, what's been happening at the protest already, and how we can challenge the state for any violence towards protesters and anything of that nature. So that's kind of the stance that we're coming from. We're just trying to find ways to make sure the legal community are showing up for Black lives and ensuring that people on the ground are getting the support they need in order to exercise their right to protest, and also in order to ensure that we can start making Black Lives Matter in society as a whole. So that's just a bit about us. My name is Ife, I'm the founder of BPLS, and I am joined today by two esteemed guests. We have Heidi Wentz and we have James Eichen. So what I think would be really good is if I kind of just do a little introduction about both of them. So I'm going to quickly just go through their bios. And once I've gone through their bios, we can get this show on the road. So Heidi Wentz is a mitigation specialist with the Long Beach Justice Project in Long Beach, California. And she works on behalf of indigent criminal defendants who are facing the death penalty. She's a lifelong activist, abolitionist, and anti-racist. So I just want to, first of all, thank Heidi for coming today. I'm really excited to hear what she has to say in her presentations, and just to showcase about the amazing work that she's been doing in America. And then we have someone a lot more close to home. We have James. So James Eichen is a qualified solicitor specializing in civil litigation. He initially joined BPLS, or BPLS is Us, as a legal observer at the BLM marches in London 2020, and he now assists us with litigation casework, connects us with our pro bono lawyers, with our clients, so that they can get support. He also runs our website and our blog. He does a lot of research for us and drafts a lot of articles. Prior to joining BPLS, James worked on a variety of projects focused on advancing social justice and policy reform in the United Kingdom, particularly looking at the legal system. And he did that with Justice, Liberty, and Amnesty International. He has previously provided legal advice and support and written a range of articles on topics such as homelessness, all the way to strategic litigation. And he's contributed to policy reports and parliamentary briefings. So we've got a really, really strong panel, and I'm really having that cross-country transnational dialogue, which is what I'm really interested about. So to kind of get today's session started, because the title was Policing, BLM Protest and the Racist Criminal Justice System. So what I think will be really, really helpful is to kind of get the panelists to give us a bit of context about what is going on. So I think I'm going to hand over to Heidi. Oh, sorry guys, we now have Erica in the building with us. So let me give Erica a little welcome before I move on to Heidi to do her presentation. So our third panelist today is Erica Perry. Let me just quickly read her bio. So Erica Perry is a partnerships director at Law for Black Lives. Erica Perry works at the intersection of community organizing and lawyering. She's committed to working with organizers and lawyers to weave together their dreams and visions of Black liberation, and to create policies and transformative actions that get us closer to a world free from oppression and anti-Blackness. Erica organizes with the Southerners on the New Ground and at Nashville's People's Budget Coalition to build community power. And she also does that with More Just Tennessee. While in law school, Erica taught street law at local high schools, interned with the Shelby County Public Defender's Office, clerked with Memphis Housing Authority, and was a student attorney in the Neighborhood Preservation Clinic. In 2012, Erica graduated from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, with a BA in political science with concentrations in public administration and philosophy. She graduated also from the University of Memphis Law School in 2016, and Erica's licensed to practice law in Tennessee. So again, another amazing panelist. I'm really excited for today's conversation. I think we've got a real nice mirage of excellent speakers, and I'm looking forward for you to dive in and give us answers to questions we've been dying to hear the answers for. So I think I'm gonna, as mentioned before, what we're gonna do is kind of dive into the current human rights situations or current situations, particularly look at the criminal justice system in everyone's respective countries and also respective states. So I'm going to start with Heidi. I don't know if anyone has any presentations they want to share. If they do, let me know, and I can help you with the screen share. If not, I'm going to hand the floor over to Heidi to kind of talk about what the situation is like for her in California.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I'm hearing an echo here. So I work as a mitigation specialist on capital cases, which for those of you that don't know, the capital punishment is alive and well in the United States, and unfortunately alive and well in California, where I am, and is steeped in racism. And so my job, I would say I'm on the front lines of fighting the death penalty on an individual scale, case by case. My clients are facing the death penalty, and my job is to do research into their backgrounds, their histories, their family history, going back generations, to come up with a biopsychosocial history on them in the hopes that we can convince a jury, if we get to trial, that the jury should spare their lives and give them life without parole versus the death penalty. I don't know how much, Ife, you want me to get into my day-to-day operations, but that's where I'm coming from. That's what my job is. I guess I'll just leave it at that for now.
It would also be good to kind of know the context of the systems you're operating in terms of like Black people on death row, you know, the amount of people on death row, just a bit of context for the audience, just to know kind of what you're up against and what you're facing.
Well, right now I'm primarily working in Riverside County in California, which is a Southern California county. It's east of Los Angeles. It's kind of out in the desert area. And Riverside County, unfortunately, is one of the worst counties in the country for sending people to death row. They've had more cases there sent to death row than a lot of other states combined. And so what was the second part of your question?
Just kind of like, you know, maybe how much people are on death row, if you know the actual statistics, and just the racial disparity in that as well, possibly.
Well, one thing that, you know, I was just looking at this morning, I don't know if people are aware, we have a federal death penalty as well. And for the longest time, there were no executions. And they, unfortunately, under the Trump administration, have started up executions again. And I was just looking at a case, a man that's about to be executed tomorrow, actually. And he is fighting that case on the basis of racial discrimination. He was convicted in Texas. And the statistics there are pretty crazy, about how much more likely, especially Black men, are likely to, in the outset, to have a prosecutor seek the death penalty against them. The statistics are that they're 8 times more likely to be, for a prosecutor to decide to even try to seek the death penalty against them. Once that happens, they are 16 times more likely to be convicted and given the death penalty than non-Black defendants are. And so the numbers are deeply racist, I would say, especially in the federal death penalty. Out where I am working, most of the clients that I have out there are actually of Mexican-American descent. And a lot of the clients that are being sent to death row from Riverside are of that background, just based on the population out in Riverside. So it's a little bit different demographic, but a lot of the same issues. Way more people of color being prosecuted for the death penalty versus their white counterparts.
Thank you for sharing that. Just kind of put into context that, you know, we are literally fighting for our lives here, even in terms of prosecutions and, you know, who is being spared and who is allowed to live, and just kind of giving us that context of the racist ways in which Black bodies are being policed, particularly when it comes to prosecuting decisions and outcomes as well, sentencing outcomes. So thank you for sharing that. we're going to move on to James, kind of give us a bit of a UK perspective of things here for us, just for the audience and the panel members alike.
Yeah, so I'm here talking from Black Protest Legal Support, as we discussed. Unfortunately, I'm not one of BPLS's incredible load of criminal defense barristers who will be able to give you some great first-hand experience and stuff like that. But my role does include three key things which I think could help: legal observing, research, and policy work. And so I'm going to give an introduction of all three of those to show how the current system is, if you want to put it comfortably, racially disproportionate, and if you want to put it uncomfortably, flat out racist. Firstly, this is not new news in the UK. I mean, as far back as the Scarman report, although he refused to say institutional racism because he didn't want to define it, he said that he found police officers with actively racist views and did find unwitting and unconscious bias in the higher levels of decision making in public bodies. If people don't know, that Scarman review came after the Brixton riots in 1981, when the sus lords allowed police officers to pull over Black people in the street for no reason whatsoever, just because they said they found them suspicious, and use that as an excuse to search them. And those searches were often very, very aggressive and pretty much bordered on just beating people. We then had the McPherson review after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, which did highlight institutional racism. We've had the David Lammy review, which has said exactly the same thing across the criminal justice system. And I know that Justice, the NGO, are about to come out with another report regarding racial disproportionality in the youth justice system. So this is known. This data is very much out there. It's been published time and time again, and it's been found in so many different reports. To give a brief overview, Black people in the UK make up 3% of the population, yet are massively overrepresented in stop and search rates, arrest rates, and even under the recent coronavirus fixed penalty notices. Unfortunately, I don't have the figures right at hand as well as Heidi did, so I can't give you it instantly, but I know that the worst case example is the gangs matrix, which, depending on when you look at it, because the names fluctuate, but it's never dropped between being about 80% Black male, which is just not representative at all. So yeah, I've been thinking how I can present this in a more interesting way, because we know these figures. Anyone who's kept up with the BPLS posts has certainly seen these figures before. But I thought one thing I could highlight is that this is all the upper level stuff. These are the figures for the whole country. But our legal observing experience has given us face-to-face experience of this. And that has been shocking, even for those of us that knew what it was. We have a selection of legal observers who've been turning up to pretty much every BLM protest, certainly every BLM protest in London since May, and many across the country as well. And what we've seen time and time again is the police treat our Black legal observers so much worse than our white legal observers. I mean, across the board, we have cases of the police laughing at legal observers, as not taking them seriously, being actively hostile to them. And bear in mind, these legal observers, their job is simply to stand in a public place and take notes. They're not allowed any special privileges. They're members of the public, but they're in a public space. They're allowed to be there, and all they do is take notes of what happens. And I should also be clear that this happens to both our Black and white, but it lands far more heavily on our Black legal observers. I was read through our reports to try and get some evidence of this together, and I read through one report which one Black legal observer had one police officer who consistently told her to F off when she was just doing her job, physically pushed her away from situations where, again, all she was doing was standing there and taking notes. It got to the point where she asked one of our white legal observers to walk around with her because she didn't feel safe walking around with this police officer in the area. And so that really shows just how extensive this is. I mean, we've all heard the figures, we all know how disproportionate it is, but it's happening day to day. And, you know, we don't have the death penalty, and so we don't have as much on the line as Heidi's clients do, but the fact is it's everywhere. And we've seen that on the ground throughout the BLM protests.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to also highlight on top of what James was saying as well, when we look at deaths in custody, and even if you look at the BAME statistics, which is a third, even within that statistic, half of the people that are BAMEs are black. BAME is what we used to describe Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. Also, of those 500 deaths, half of those are people that are Black that have died in police custody. So in terms of being disproportionately represented in that figure as well, we, are feeling the effects of, disproportionate, forceful and unfair policing. So thank you for sharing that, James, and kind of highlighting a lot of our work, particularly on the ground. So yes, that was really good. So I'm going to move on to Eric, and I'll kind of tell us about what situation it is for her in Tennessee and the spaces that she's finding herself working in.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us and for having me. So yeah, I mean, what we know is that the criminal justice system in the U.S. is rooted and driven by anti-Blackness, classism, homophobia, misogyny, and transphobia and xenophobia. And so and this shows up every day when we encounter the police, when we're in courtrooms. And the truth is every DA, every judge, every police officer, probation officer, I mean, even every lawyer, correctional officer, and the elected officials who invest billions of dollars into these institutions are baptized by white supremacy and anti-Blackness, because it's a necessary function of any training that you experience in law school, any training you experience as a police officer or correctional officer, that it is a part and woven into the institutions. And then I think the other thing just to name is that we know that the criminal justice system, sometimes we call it the criminal legal system because it lacks justice, is a function and a tool deemed to used to control undesirables. And it's Black folks, there's immigrants, there's trans folks, there's queer folks, it's cash poor folks. And then to throw those people away when they no longer find them usable or find us to be desirable. And because of this, we know that over 987 people have already been killed by the police this year. And that number doesn't even capture the people who are killed in police custody right now, or the people who are being murdered right now inside of jails and prisons because of COVID-19 and lack of health care. I was in a jail last week, and nobody had a mask on, y'all. Nobody had a mask on. And it was a smaller jail, but nobody had a mask on. And then, we know that Black people make up 13% of the population, but are disproportionately killed by the police every year. And I know those numbers are don't even reflect the totality of police violence, sexual violence that our people are experiencing, or the transphobia that our people are experiencing by the police. And then, 2.3 million people are confined in U.S. jails, prisons, right now in the United States. And that doesn't even account, I think, for the number of people who are on who are being surveilled by the police, who are on ankle monitors and things like that. And then, and I just want to name that, it's clear that the institutions are racist, violent, and harmful. And it's also really clear that they don't even provide safety, right? So we know that it's not even rooted and driven by the idea of public safety, that it is rooted in anti-Blackness and a desire to control and contain people. But they use the messaging of safety to try to convince people that it's okay to invest billions of dollars into these institutions. And so, at Law for Black Lives, we've been doing work around invest, divest work, which is let's invest in communities, invest in housing, education, real public safety, and divest from institutions like policing and jails. And so we did a report a few years ago, which really helped really look at what the numbers are. And so shout out to Marbre, who's the ED of Law for Black Lives, and Kumar, who also helped with that in BYP 100, who wrote the report, who looked at police budgets throughout the country and saw that disproportionately millions of dollars were going into police budgets. In some places it was billions. So you look at LA and New York and larger cities. And we see this increase over the last 30 years. And I would want to name the budget and name the numbers because it's important to that shows us where our heart is in this country, right? Where our vision and our investments are. And so over the last 30 years, the U.S. has drastically increased investments in policing and incarceration, while at the same time cutting social safety nets. So we see this wave of bills that further criminalize people. The 94 crime bill. We see bills that further continue to to demonize people who are immigrants. We see like bills that continue to like separate families through like the child welfare system, while at the same time cutting social safety nets, cutting education. And so we looked across the country and saw that like, again, communities were spending like millions of dollars, billions of dollars on policing while divesting from other institutions that actually do keep us safe. And so I think for me, when we think about the criminal justice system, it's a part of a larger institution where we're looking at its role in racialized capitalism, its role in controlling our communities. And so like, and really refusing to address social issues.
Thank you for that amazing breakdown and just giving us the context and what we are operating in. So I'm now going to, thank you everyone for doing that as well. So now I'm going to ask a few questions. So the first one is kind of reflecting on a quote which says, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. How did the 2020 BLM uprisings feel like we've been here before? Maybe Heidi wants to go first.
I think, I've been an activist since I was a kid. My mom was a civil rights worker back in the 60s in Alabama. And so I was sort of raised by an activist mommy, single mother. And, I've been studying some stuff that Sean King has come up with. He talks about something called the dip, where in history, we expect when we want to think about history, we want to think that we're on this train of progress and that things are slowly getting better. And yes, maybe things have slowly gotten better in this country. Obviously, we don't have the institution of slavery anymore. But what he talks about is how that line is not a steady line up, that we have these dips. And so what I believe we're in now is another very deep dip. There's been an underpinning of racism in this country since forever. And now I think with Trump emboldening these people, it's just gotten 10 times worse. And here we are, we find ourselves back, saying the same things that, our parents and generations ahead of us have been saying for generations now, fighting for the same things that we've been fighting for so long, and dealing with the same issues that we've been dealing with for so long. And so it just feels like, it does feel like Groundhog Day again, out in the streets, fighting for the same things. We're obviously making some progress, but I think we're in sort of a critical moment right now with this change of administration where we have an opportunity, I hope, to affect some actual change in government, depending on who Biden brings in and his transition team and who he's going to appoint into his cabinet, and what policies they're going to enact. I haven't been super enthusiastic for what I've seen so far as what he's doing. I think there's a tendency when a Democrat comes into power for people to just kind of sit back and go, oh, okay, everything's going to be fine now. But that's far from the case. The crime bill was enacted under Democratic rule in this country, and mass incarceration was, blew up after that. And so I think we still have a long way to go, unfortunately.
Thank you for that, Heidi. So it's going to move on to James to answer the same question.
Yeah, so I think this is kind of perfectly timed because, as people in the UK might know, a few days ago, the Joint Committee on Human Rights brought out a report regarding Black people and racism in the UK. And in many ways, it was a really disappointing report because it didn't say much, but that was kind of the point to it. The point made is that, as I said before, this data is not new. When I've been doing research on our various kind of reports around this, like, there's not really been a point when the police haven't been racist. If you look in the kind of mid 20th century, pre-war, post-war, through the 70s, through the 80s, it's been a very well acknowledged fact that the police were being racist. And there have been movements away from the terrible practices that preceded this. But what they really showed in that report was that the recommendations that have been made time and time again are never taken up. There have been so many, again, if we just consider take the Scarman report as the beginning of the first like really big inquiry that said, hey, there's racism in the police, and what happened from then on, these ideas, research was done. Well, no, normally there were complaints from the public in the form of protests, in the form of like big community action. Eventually the government take notice and they do a study into it. A report is produced. That report has recommendations on how to fix it, and then nothing happens. And then all the stuff which could have fixed the issues, maybe not completely, but could have made a big impact, is just brushed under the carpet. And then, yeah, 5-10 years down the line, the same things happen again because they've been happening for the whole time, and eventually the community doesn't put up with it anymore. So I think that what that report really showed is exactly this. Like, the BLM protests obviously were sparked by George Floyd's death, but what they did in the UK is draw attention to the racist police practices that were already present. We don't have police with guns, and so you don't get the same shots on the news of police shooting unarmed Black people in the street. But as you said, Black people die in custody. I think they make, again, making up 3% of the population, they make up about 10% of deaths in custody. Not to mention police use force against Black people in the UK at 4 times the rate they use it against white people. And although all this data was brought to the surface through the BLM protests, it was known. The police know they do this. The police know they've always done this, and the data has always been there. And a lot of this could have been helped if the recommendations from all those previous reports had been put into effect. I think just for one final point to play this, to show this, during my research, I tried to look into how the police defend some of these actions, and I found this report from a police academic discussing the racist disproportionality in stop and search rates. And even his evidence couldn't put it aside. Even after doing everything they could to twist the statistics, they couldn't find a way that it wasn't disproportionate. But the thing I found funniest was that the data they used to show this was checking on how racist stop and searches were in 5 specific areas. Those 5 areas were all areas that put in recommendation 61 from the Scarman report, which specifically required them to take note of the ethnicity of people they were stopping and searching, all in the knowledge that they had been disproportionate. And so the best that their report could really show is that, hey, listening to these recommendations actually kind of helped. And it was still racist and it was still disproportionate. But what they showed is that in areas where the recommendations are taken on and are put into effect, there's slightly less disproportionality than there is elsewhere. And so again, we know it works. It's been shown in studies to work time and time again. We have all the recommendations. We need to fix this. Just no one's doing anything. And so we can expect this cycle to keep repeating until they do something.
Thank you for highlighting, James. I remember at the process, I was hearing people, they were chanting, implement the recommendations, implement, because it's like we've got it there already and it's just being ignored. And it's those that have the power to do something are indifferent or not bothered to do what they need to do to make a change. So I'm going to move on to Erica now to answer the same question.
Yeah, I think, the uprisings that we, saw take place this summer and continue into some of the fall felt really similar to what we saw in 2015 and 2014. The uprisings in the late 60s in the US. But it also felt different. From what I understand, the uprisings this year are the largest uprisings that we, seen in the US. Ever, and we, we were able to mobilize millions of people into the streets and change the conversation locally and nationally about the legitimacy and the role of policing. We go even beyond that and say because of the uprisings and the work that Black movement did, we defeated Trump. Right. And then, what's also clear is the establishment has responded similarly as they did in 2014, 15 and before. And that the establishment includes Biden, it includes Kamala Harris, it includes our local mayors and governors and city council folks in many places. And so, the response was similar in attempting to double down on what it looks like to invest in policing, even recommending reform when we were calling for defunding the police, taking money from the police and actually putting in our communities. Many elected officials came back and said, well, actually, let's invest more in the police. It's maybe possible to reform them. And we had already seen there's no reform in an institution rooted in anti-Blackness, slavery, and classism, like that. There's no reforming that. And so that's one piece of it, right? Them doubling down on like policing. But we also saw them targeting protesters and organizers, and also in many places increasing the police budget, right? We saw some wins where the police budget decreased, but we saw some places where like they were like, nah, we still gonna invest in the police, or let's give the police cameras, even though we know that doesn't work. We've seen our people be killed on camera, and it doesn't work because it is a function of policing to harm Black people, to harm our communities. And I think the other thing that I want to name is that feels different about this time, right? 2020, is that we were again able to organize, and mobilize millions of people around the demand to defund the police, and so really capturing the hearts and minds of our people and delegitimizing policing as like an institution that is supposed to like carry out public safety, and really like thinking about alternatives in ways and a scale that we haven't been able to do before. And then I think the other thing is that like we built on the work that Black folks have been doing for decades and articulated a vision for freedom that honors our dignity and humanity, and includes wide scale investments in our communities and a shift into policies and practices they get us closer to communities that we deserve. And so I think like this year was absolutely and has been beautiful in the way that we've seen our people be mobilized and really critique the U.S. as we know it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Erica. I've definitely felt a different, change in the wind and the air in terms of the language being used, the way in which we're going about activism, and how we are seeking to protect our communities, and what demands we're asking for, and how we are envisioning the change we want to see. And we're saying we don't want reforms. We've been offered reforms, and we're still where we are. And it's like, actually, we don't want history to repeat itself. We want to think of new imaginative ways in which we're not going to be here in 20 years' time. We want to think of new ways. And I think that's what I definitely felt about this time round. I felt a different energy. So that was nice that you guys all shared similar understandings and reflections on that too. So the next question that I thought, which is really good because we've spoken about the protest, was like, how were you able to show up for Black lives during the protests, these 2020 protests? How do you want to start? Oh, you're on mute. Oh. Yeah.
Oh, I keep muting and unmuting at the wrong time. Sorry. Talking with my mute button on. Honestly, I don't feel like I showed up enough. I think that my personal situation, I have 4 kids at home who are all online schooling. And I have older parents who, especially with the outset of the pandemic, I was having to take care of bringing them food, supplies, things that they couldn't get on their own, just because it didn't feel safe at that point to even go out into a grocery store. So I think Erica is probably a lot more a better person to answer this question than me as far as showing up. A lot of the work that I've done just from home has been, making phone calls when I could. I'm a big fan of Sean King and a lot of the work he does. And so when he puts out calls for people to start making phone calls and doing stuff like that, I've been able to do that kind of work, but I was not out in the streets actively protesting this time around, just due to my unfortunate home circumstances. So I think I'm quite sure Erica can answer this question better than I can.
But Heidi, I do think what you're saying, you were still able to show up, and obviously all your work beforehand has been showing up for Black people anyway. So I think in any event, you've been showing up for us anyway. So I think the phone calls are just as important. We need, the different part of the bodies. We need different people to do different things. I think whatever you can do and you have done is amazing. And yes, so you need to be able to give honor where honor is due. So I'm going to go on to Erica, because Erica's been shouted out to answer this question. So Erica, do you want to take the floor?
Yeah, this summer was a lot, but yeah, so the work, I did a lot of legal support, and then a lot of like organizing. And so locally in Nashville, I was a part of a campaign to It's a campaign started around Invest, Divest. So again, like divesting from policing in prisons and jails, surveillance, and investing in like education, healthcare, things like that. And so we engaged in like work to mobilize people around the call to defund cops and cages. And so for us, and we were like, let's defund the police, and we also mean jails. We also mean like youth detention centers. We also mean the child welfare system. And the DA's office, and the sheriff's department. And so we engaged in a fight with city council to try to get money taken out of the police budget and the sheriff's budget. And so that was like quite a bit of the summer. And it was absolutely beautiful. And then I think a part of that was also like articulating what our vision actually is. So like working with people around participatory democracy and participatory budgeting to say like, well, what do you want to invest in? And then trying to push city council on that. Of course, city council did not move. And so we're like, well, we're going to get you out of your seat in a few years. But then I think the other thing was like with Law for Black Lives, really focusing on like legal support and rapid response work, because again, millions of people are in the streets. And so we were really trying to respond to this moment by making sure folks had lawyers and bail when they were getting arrested, and that where legal infrastructure did exist, that we were able to support them in whatever way felt necessary. But yeah, I think like this summer was absolutely a beautiful moment that was led by like the Movement for Black Lives and local movements who, folks who have been doing the work, like, BYP 100, Center for Popular Democracy, Free Hearts, Southerners on New Grounds have actually been doing the work to like really move our communities away from investment into policing and cages. And so to really see us use the momentum that was built off of people's cry to defund the police and to take that locally, I think was powerful and beautiful. And I've seen that work continue into the fall.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that, Erica. Like that move and the fusion between the lawyers and the organizers. I think that's really powerful, and kind of working with them to kind of see what you can do, see what institutions you can push these demands at, and make your demands clear and say, you know what, if we're not going to listen to us, we're going to get you out of office. We're going to vote you out. So I feel like it's really important to have that collective group communal response, and I felt like what you're saying really reflected on that. And I think we have similar experiences to share, which I'm sure James will touch on as well.
Yeah. So I can absolutely see everything you were saying there. I know that personally, the reason I showed up for the Black Lives protests, I think is similar to a lot of the legal observers through BPLS, is that the protests were an incredible sign of people's like passion for what was happening, for trying to fix the issues. But what I knew is that protests, they're great at galvanizing support. They're great at showing your intent to the government, but they need to be backed up by legal and policy work, because otherwise they can be so easily brushed aside. As shown with the legal observers on the ground, were there to make sure that the police couldn't just shove these people off the streets and pretend the protest never happened. They were there to make sure that the media or the police or whoever else couldn't just graft all the protesters as somehow violent or whatever else and kind of get away with it and pretend that they'd be justified in the kettling or the actual cavalry charge that they did. They full on rode horses into the crowd at one point. And the legal observers were there to make sure they couldn't get away with that kind of thing and just no one would know about it. So I was able to show up for the Black Lives protest because just to take it out to the personal point of the question very quickly. I left private practice in 2019 and started working with NGOs, and I discovered exactly the same thing. Like, the way you make changes is by getting your voice to the decision makers, and like getting your voice out in the streets is important. Protests are important, but like a lot of the key work is done by making sure that the voice isn't just out in the streets. It's there in Westminster. It's there in the boardrooms. It's like there where they have to listen to it. And so, yeah, when I just come off the back of an internship with an NGO that did exactly that kind of work, and when I saw the BLM protests, I was like, it just fitted in. This is exactly what we need to do again. So that was the key reason I got involved, and the key reason I was able to get involved is I knew that I had the legal training to help with that, in terms of going to the protests and like taking the right notes and knowing what to look out for, and also to supporting protesters with their legal rights. Like we found time and time again, the police try and threaten people with unlawful stuff all the time. They just claim they can do a thing and they hope they never call their bluff. And like most people won't, because it's a policeman with a baton, and if he says you've got to get out the street, then you're probably going to get out the street. But if you have that knowledge, then you can know, well, like, no, actually, you can't ask me to do that. You can't search me right now. You can't arrest him with no charge. Like, and as soon as you have that knowledge there, the tables they're not equal, but it helps a lot. And again, that's something that you can do if you're there with just like a little bit of legal training. It's a lot of the time the bluff is so obvious. Like they're trying to do something that is clearly unlawful, and so a little knowledge can go a long way. So yeah, that was for me personally. I think the same thing is the protests are so good, and it was so incredible they happened, and every person there made a big point by getting their voice to it and showing that they cared enough to do that. But you do need the legal and policy stuff to back that up as well. I think that was the big step that BPLS overall and myself personally were trying to do.
Thank you for sharing that. I think because we've spoken about the protests and kind of contextually what was happening, it'll be good to kind of have a bit more knowledge about what was going on the ground, particularly for those that were legal observers. So the next question is, what was the reaction to the BLM protesters and legal observers by the police in the USA and the UK?
I can go. Yeah. Yeah, the police acted as we know them to be. They are violent, right? They terrorize our communities regularly, and so when they got in the streets, they did what they do in our communities every day. And so, in a number of places, they showed up in riot gear, targeted protesters, worked with prosecutors and judges to keep folks in jail on high bail, and then also exposed people to COVID by arresting like hundreds of people at a time and throwing them in jail. Then also, we know they beat and terrorized community members. It looked a lot similar. Like when you look at the pictures, it looked similar in some ways to what it did in the 60s. And so the institution of policing has not changed. And then, we saw them work and just want to name that they also have been working with federal officers, like local police officers in so-called progressive cities have been working with federal agents who have been pushed out by like the Trump administration to bring federal charges against people who are in the streets, against organizers and against protesters. And that's important to like really name and contextualize like the way that we see policing, no matter like how progressive your city is, actually be targeted and trying to like undermine our movements. And then they also, again, in that same like lane, have been raiding people's homes and offices as a way to like scare people and get people to be quiet and to stop organizing. Like even here locally, we saw the police actually like put on their SWAT gear, right? Put on like their like gear that you would see folks use in the military, which is wrong in any way. But we saw them go into like people's homes and snatch them up and take them into like a local jail and charge them. So yeah, I think that's just one example of the way that we see the police show up and do the work of really undermining our community's call for like actual real justice, for actual real public safety, for real accountability.
I just want to dovetail on that too. I think one of the tools that they use when they do arrest people is overcharging. They overcharge people with ridiculous things like inciting riots or, using weapons against police, assaulting police when they're the ones getting beat or getting shot, or, losing eyes, losing, there's just been horrific stuff that's happened with these less than lethal weapons when they aim them at your head, which they're never supposed to do legally. They've caused crazy damage to people's bodies and also just trauma, I think, to people. They've caused a lot of trauma, again, in the communities that they already over police and terrorize. And this has just added another layer, I think, of terror that they perpetuate in communities.
Yeah. So to prepare for this question, I read through a load of reports from our legal observers from some of the biggest days in recent protests, and wow, it makes for intense reading. Like the protest, I personally legally observed that there were a lot of riot police about, but I never saw an actual confrontation. We saw some wrongful arrests, we saw some physical abuse, but the riot police never charged anyone while I was there. But they charged a lot of other people. Like I was reading through the protests on the 6th and 7th of June, which were the biggest ones in London, and as I said, at one point they lined up cavalry and charged protesters. At another point, they had decided to kettle the protesters, and the police there with their riot shields, batons, the whole thing. And we're talking about 10 o'clock in the afternoon now. A vast majority of the protesters had left. So there's a group of like 100 odd there, and the police outnumbered them at least 2 to 1, probably more. They had vulnerable people in the crowd. They had kids in the crowd, people who needed to leave for medical reasons, refused all of that and just crushed these people in more and more. And I'm reading all of this, and there's no triggering event. There's no, the protesters aren't doing anything violent. None of them have weapons. Most of them previous to that are like dancing and shouting. But because they're near Downing Street, I guess, maybe because it's gone on past 9 p.m. I don't know what excuse the police were using, but at a certain point they decide that the right response to this peaceful protest, which isn't harming anyone, is to get the riot shields out and charge them with horses. And yeah, so the police reaction was it was horrifying to see. And like again, from the notes of the legal observers were there, like it was just pure aggression. Like they were shoving people to the ground and then hauling them on and throwing them in front of them when these people had, they were locking up bikes. There's one point where there's a homeless guy at the side of the street and the policeman pick him up and throw him down the street as well. I mean, that's like a very vulnerable person who clearly wasn't even part of the process, and that's just their go-to reaction is smashing stuff and swearing at people. So yeah, the riot police that came out in the protest was quite a sight to see, as shown in the reports from our legal observers.
Yes, thank you for showcasing that. And yeah, we had some of our legal observers were kettled to 2 a.m. in the morning. They couldn't leave. And we saw that the police were trying to use the kettling as a data gathering exercise. So they were using people's address information and date of birth to basically be a bargaining chip to be let out of the kettle. And if you didn't, and even the way they were asking it was actually potentially unlawful, but they still went ahead with it anyway. So we were seeing a lot of them. We also saw a big use on facial recognition and the idea of like collect people's data. So people that had left the kettle, they were like forced to go in front of a van and have their like whole head to toe like recorded and have all their data collected. So I felt like we were seeing, increased levels of policing, over policing, and just, them taking advantage of the situation that the people protesters were in. So thank you all for highlighting disproportionate and violent reactions, both in the UK and the US from policing. So the next question I'm going to move on to is how do abolitionist frameworks help further the aims of Black liberation?
I'll go first since you. I think I don't think there's any choice but abolition in this country to actually change it. There's no reforming this system that's been so steeped in racism. It's not reformable. It wasn't ever meant to be reformed. It was meant to be exactly what it is, which is to be the thumb on the, or the knee on the neck of the Black community and of all communities of color. I mean, the list goes on. And I think, we had a couple of good wins here in Los Angeles County. We elected a new district attorney who was formerly the district attorney in San Francisco. And then he's now come down here, thank God. On his first day in office, he announced that he was not going to seek the death penalty on anyone anymore. And so I think, putting someone like him in office is going to hopefully have some really lasting permanent effects. We also passed a measure in LA County that 10% of the county budget now has to go to community programs, which, in LA County, we're talking about billions of dollars in the budget every year. And so that 10% chunk it may seem like, oh, it's only 10%, but that's actually going to do hopefully mountains of good in communities that need it. In the framework that I work in, you know, dealing with the death penalty every day, I mean, the fact that Mr. Gascon has now decided not to seek death on anyone in LA County is like, okay, good. Now I'm out of a job in LA County. It's great. But here, you know, still out in Riverside, they're happy to just keep going the way that they've been going for decades. And I think that, you know, we don't have a choice but to abolish the system and to come up with something new and to come up with something that's actually going to support communities and, you know, build frameworks of support, restorative justice, getting away from penalizing people, and actually getting to the roots of what causes all of everything that where my clients end up sitting. Why did they end up there? It's through failures of education, through failures of dealing with violence in those communities, and the deep racism that's kept them there for that long. So.
Thank you for sharing that. I think, James, you want to go next?
Yeah, so I can do a quick discussion of this. So yeah, as you said, the system is based essentially, the policing system is basically based on having as much power as possible. I think a key example of this is the use of stop and search. So I did a lot of research into this recently for a Home Office consultation we did. We sent our data into them, and time and time again, you'll see quotes from police officers saying, "Oh, stop and search is like a very essential part of investigation. Like we couldn't work without it." But then when you look at the figures, they only find something in maximum less than 20% of searches. And if you look at Section 60 searches, which for the American audience, that's if they put a Section 60 order in place in a certain area, they don't need any excuse to search people. The police can stop anyone in that area and say, there's a Section 60 order in place, I'm going to search you. And in that, I think it's less than 2, maybe less than 1% of searches they find anything. So a vast majority of searches don't turn up anything at all. So in terms of an investigation, not very useful. Also, for the times they do find it, it tends to be in searches where there was a specific behavioral thing, which makes sense, right? Like it's when they saw someone, you know, climbing out of a house window or something, and then they find they stole something from the house when they searched them. That kind of one makes sense. But then more often, the search reasons are really just ridiculous. The infamous one is they smelled weed. Use that as an excuse to police use that as an excuse to stop someone for no reason whatsoever and then search them for drugs and see what they find. So even when it works when they base it off behavior. And it's also terrible at deterring crime. There's been studies that have looked at rates of crime in a specific area in the months before and after the police enact some really stringent strip and search. And it makes little to no impact on the rates of crime in the area. So this is an entirely useless tool, but the police refuse to let it go. And I think it's similar to police in America, probably with guns. Like, I imagine every police officer will say, oh, I couldn't do my job without it. It's because it gives them more power. And it's the same with stop and search. If you give anyone more power, they're going to praise the thing that gives them that power. And so one of the key steps towards Black liberation would be one of two things, both of which it can do, is lessening the power and making sure that more of the people from the local community have a hand in utilizing that power. The police at the moment, it's largely white. It's still built on a foundation of institutional racism. So that power is in the hands of people who use it against marginalized communities, as is shown time and time again in all the data from all the research that we've discussed so far. So the best step to do that will be to break down huge levels of that power, give more money to community support that can actually help drive down crime rates. And for the bit of power that they do still need to have, like, I can see there are situations where having an investigative body with kind of more stronger arm could be useful in terms of fighting actual crimes, the ones that don't stop through the support. But again, that should be connected to the community as much as possible. The officers should come from the community so that they know that they don't have to use that power all the time. They should be people who these people in the community sees walking around, so that they, actually have a connection with them, rather than their first reaction being to stop and search, or their first reaction being to arrest. And most importantly, at the decision-making level, there need to be people from those communities there, so that they know when the guy says like, oh, well, we need a really strong stop and search in this area, someone from the community could say, well, no, I know that area, there's not actually that much crime there, and they already distrust the police, so let's not do that. Let's, have a more intelligent decision behind this. So yeah, the abolitionist framework would help in the key ways of reducing the racist power that exists in the police force, and for what power is left, hopefully putting it into the community hands and decision makers into the right areas.
Erica, do you want to go next now?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I think the the abolitionist framework continues on the work for me of like our ancestors who fought to abolish chattel slavery and then fought against Jim Crow and white terrorism. And like in that fighting we're fighting for Black liberation and really fighting for freedom and for the right to live whole and healthy lives. And so that's the work I continue to do, especially as like a Black queer person, born, raised out of like Southern US. And so, yeah, it's like, for me, it's a tool to help us get real clear on what freedom we are fighting for, how we fight, and what the journey looks like, and acts as a map in like the struggle for Black liberation, in that, we know that Black people cannot be free in a society that includes any type of prisons or jails or police or surveillance or like the child welfare system, or any institution that separates families and creates social issues, and then it's like, I'm gonna deal with the social issues through like control and containment. And I think the other thing, just to kind of build on like what John and Heidi said, was just that it is also like a piece of a limiters test, where we're like, oh, what types of compromise or reforms are we willing to accept? Does this get us closer to actually a place where we don't have prisons and police, or does this get us or this is like re-entrench the power of policing and prisons? And I think an example of that is like, the conversations we've been having around police cameras or things like that. And so like, even we look at Biden and he's like, well, I hear y'all saying defund the police. I don't support it. I'm going to actually fund the police and try to like train them. And we're like, y'all been training them. They have anti-bias training. They have all types of training. It is their job to be racist. How are you not understanding that? Whether they are in schools with Black children, they are being racist. They are carrying out the work of white supremacy. But I think an abolitionist framework forces us to like recognize that like there is no way to reform this institution, and that like whatever policies we advocate for, whatever type of even cases and litigation we engage in, it is like in service to like taking away their power and building up the power of communities. To actually both like implement alternatives, but to also snatch that power away from like these institutions. And so I think in the next question, I'm excited to talk about some of those ways, but I think it's a test on like how we really think about reforms and reforms against reforms that we might settle for or fight for.
Yes, thank you for that. I think it's just always good to remind people that you guys have been having the training, you guys have been having the unconscious bias or the conscious bias, whichever way you want to put it, and we're still here. So we've got to think of new alternatives, because what you've been giving us has not given us anything. So I definitely agree with that. So our next question now is, how does the critical race theory give us the tools to make Black Lives Matter on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I can go. Like, Heidi, keep having to go first. I can go. Yeah, I think critical race theory forces me at least to be really clear on what we're fighting for and like who we're fighting against. And to like name that in the policies we create and advocate for, and the cases we take on, but also more importantly to be like how we write policy and how we engage in it. And so like I think critical race theory is like actually the law is, racist, white supremacist, and I would even go like just name it as transphobic and homophobic and misogynistic. And so like there is actually like it is not legitimate. It is not a moral compass. In many ways, it cannot be just, but it doesn't mean that it can't be used as a tool. And so even as we are writing policy or engaging in litigation, we do it, for me, in service to like building power And when I say build power, I mean like inviting more people into movement, engaging in political education, and engaging leadership development. So there are more people who are willing to like move up and take on the work of like dismantling these systems. And just to name, like, you know, how we do it, we're like, okay, well, we're going to engage in policy. The way we write policy, create policy, advocate policy is through participatory democracy. We do it with communities who are directly impacted by these issues. We do it in deep collaboration with organizers. And then I think the other thing that it kind of forces us to do, and this kind of gets into the movement laureate questions, but we're like, okay, yes, we don't engage in like legal work without it being like on assignment from movements. Because I think like, because the law is so dangerous, because it can be so, because it has been misused against our communities, that we have to be very careful to make sure that we are building up systems of accountability and building power so that whatever gain we may have or whatever loss we may experience, our communities are able to like engage in a real fight because we didn't do it without them.
Powerful, powerful. Thank you so much. Let's go to James so Heidi can go last.
Yeah, kind of a similar thing. And kind of my like research and policy work, like critical race theory, it forces you to accept how broad the problem is. The key thing to realize, and it's easy to lose this if you work in law, is like the law is not some objective system which can just act as some neutral, perfect external arbiter for any problems that emerge. Like it emerged from the society we live in. And not just that, like the key parts of it, you've got legislation made in Westminster, which is full of, white, powerful, middle-aged men, basically. Then you've got how the civil servants use it, which comes down to the executive, which is still those ministers, and then the police force, who, as we've said, has a very racist foundation. And then in the UK especially, you've got the case law behind it, which comes from our incredibly racist past. And it really forces you to think all those problems through and where the problems kind of come from. I'm not explaining this well, but the perfect example I saw recently was with the stop and search stuff. Again, I was looking up arguments on the other side to see what we should be countering. And one of them that came up was about available populations. And the idea behind it was, the reason like black people are stopped and searched more than white people is that they are more available in the public times. They are in the places where stop and searches take place at the times when stop and searches take place. And they just pass that off as like an argument for like, and therefore they're going to get stopped more. And like, as soon as you think about that, it makes no sense, because like, first of all, the police are in charge of those places and those times. The police, the very people we've said are institutionally racist, decide where they search and when they search. And so the fact that there's more black people around at those places and times is self-fulfilling. Not to mention, you just look a little bit deeper and you're like, why might that be the case? Like, why might black people, for example, be walking around more in like residential areas at certain times of the day, when you look at the system that has a real bias against black people in terms of employment, in terms of school exclusion, in terms of poor housing, in terms of all these other relevant factors. And suddenly the fact that even if there were more black people walking through a certain area at a certain time, which again is only the areas they choose to search, like it's so much deeper than that. It's because there's so much racism throughout the rest of the system. It's not this subjective sign of like, this is the case and therefore if we compare stop and search rates to it, it's fine. No, the critical race theory shows you just how endemic the problem is and how it affects so many different factors, and all of those are relevant. We can't just claim that like, well, the law says this and therefore this is fine. You have to look at everything behind it. So yeah, I think that shows us that it shows us how that we can't measure this stuff day to day like they'd like us to.
Thank you. Now to Heidi.
Yay! I guess I want to add on a little bit just about, I think in the US, we're at this point where there has to be a reckoning with our racist past. And I think, you know, there's been so much, the way history has been written mostly by white people in this country. You know, textbooks, the stuff that we teach our children, there has to be a real reckoning in our communities to actually look at how racism has affected the legal system, how it's affected education, how it's affected, you know, bank lending, redlining in in communities. And I think until we actually have a real reckoning and deal with things like reparations and acknowledging the deep effects that, you know, hundreds of years of slavery had on this country, and just the deeply ingrained bias and beliefs that people have that maybe they're not even that aware of. I think one of the things that the summer brought out in a lot of people was just sort of and I think, you know, Erica was talking about how it did feel different, that there was a bit of an awakening amongst people, in acknowledging those things, and actually looking at history and reading history written by non-white people to actually, you know, see what our true history is, and not glossing over, you know, the ugliness of it, which, you know, then you have Trump saying that, you know, like the 1619 education project shouldn't happen because, oh, it's going to, you know, it's so scary because we actually have to have a reckoning and we have to look at these things, and acknowledge that they happen, and then take those things and try to figure out, how do we correct this? You know, how are we going to have reparations? Because clearly, you know, people need to have them. And I think, you know, like in South Africa, they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right, where they went through and people were, you know, came and testified and talked about all these absolutely horrible things that happened, but they were able to like pull the skin off of the, you know, the onion and look at all the layers and examine how that's affected their country, and then try to move forward from that. I mean, it's arguable, I don't, you know, how far they've moved forward since then, but I think we need something like that in this country, some type of Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looks at the real deep effects that all of these things have had. And it should be in an open public forum so that everyone can see and listen and hear what it's really been like for Black and other marginalized people in this country, and then move forward from there with things that are actually going to make real change, not, you know, neoliberal band-aids on on these problems, which I unfortunately believe that's what the Biden administration plans on bringing in, is just, okay, well, we'll put a little band-aid here. Okay, we'll stop the little leak here, and do these little things just to sort of placate people. But I have a lot of hope that because of the movement and the momentum that's been built up through the summer, I hope people don't become complacent and back off and let the momentum kind of die down. And I know that there are especially some amazing Black women leaders who are at the forefront of leading the movement here in the US, that are pushing forward and really trying to make real change happen and put people in positions of power that can actually make real change. We'll see what happens.
Yeah,
be interesting.
I think, as you said, this is not a time to be complacent. Actually, it's time to start doubling down, and there's so much to do. And I really like the example you just given of this sort of truth and reconciliation space, because I feel like all too often people just try to dismiss and be like, oh, but just move on, and oh, it's not that serious. And actually, it is very serious, and it is affecting us. We're struggling to breathe, literally, in so many different ways. And I feel like until people sit down and maybe even have that conversation or have that legitimacy from an institutional space that's recognizing what's been happening to us and what continues to happen to us, how can we go forward when we haven't accepted what's going on now? So I really like that point. And also just kind of thinking about critical race theory and the language it gives everybody, or people that are familiar with the theory. I wanted to know how, if you have been able to so far, if you're thinking in the future, you know, how has critical race theory been able to help you maneuver through the racist criminal justice system that we're operating in?
I'll go first this time if you like. Mainly because unfortunately I'm not going to have as much to say as you guys on this, because I don't have as much first-hand experience working in this area as you. Like I joined BPLS recently, and like I'm loving what I'm doing, but it's mainly research and policy. Like I'm very much a backroom kind of guy at this, which I enjoy, but it doesn't give me as interesting a stories as for other people. But even within that, I found it fascinating because it's in a research position, it really forces me to look kind of past the data. I think a big example that popped up recently was arrest rates. And again, like a lot of the research I do is trying to look into the other side's arguments and kind of pick them apart. And critical race theory makes that really easy, because you realize that there's so much stuff that they just take as like skin deep is as far as they go. So arrest rates is a classic one that I found, and they're basically often used as a measure of crime rates. And the ones I looked up, and in fairness, this was from about 2000, I think Black people made up 3% of the population, but 5% of arrests or something. And they basically pointed to this and like, see, Black people are like, they're more likely to commit crime or whatever they were claiming. And as soon as you pick that apart, especially with critical race theory, like there's nothing beneath it. Because firstly, like police arrests are the police arresting people, and the police are the institutionally racist body we're talking about. So how are you going to use that as a measurement, as like an objective yardstick to hold them up against? That makes no sense. And then again, we look past behind that and you see how built into the system it is. You see that, you know, at that point, stop and search was, I think, off the board. You also had school exclusion, and it has a massive effect on it. And again, hugely difficult for Black children. And then you've got the things we mentioned earlier. You have employment issues, you have housing issues. There are so many factors from society that force that figure into place, that to try and take it as some objective measurement is just ludicrous. And critical race theory has really helped me with that. It's now when, you know, you see these theories that they tout, it's so easy to just kind of push it aside and be like, well, yeah, because of all this institutional racism that happened right before this point. It's not an objective yardstick to measure against. It's a symptom of the very problem we're talking about. So it's helped me for that. And I definitely want to keep taking it forwards with me, into policy work as well.
Great, thank you, James, for that. Just letting us know how it's just giving you the practical skills that you need, that we all need. I think we should all read critical race theory. So Heidi, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think because, you know, my work in the justice system is obviously on a case-by-case basis, and I don't work on a lot of cases at one time because they require so much work. Each case requires so much work. But I think, you know, the battle that I face on a daily basis is trying to figure out how to humanize this person that, you know, that I'm helping represent in the case to a jury, and how to explain how someone goes from their mother's womb to now facing, getting killed by the state. And so I think looking at critical race theory, you know, it allows us to look at different institutions, institutional failure of the education system, failure of the welfare system, failure of even, you know, for one of the clients I have right now, he was incarcerated for most of his life and was kind of raised in the justice system, raised in jails and now in prisons. And I think, you know, it allows me to kind of look at the effects of all of those things on a smaller scale, you know, on an individual case-by-case basis, and use them as tools to argue potentially, you know, how has the system completely failed this individual to the point where they were so traumatized, they were so you know, just kind of driven to the ground and had no resources to help themselves get out of it and move forward with their life or be productive, or even, you know, when they maybe had productive times in their lives, why they were not able to maintain that and then fell back into, you know, whatever may have brought them where they were, whether it was drug addiction or involvement with gangs or whatever it might be. I think it's sort of an evolving thing, at least in my line of work, of us looking at all of those things and then trying to figure out ways through documents, through the interviews that we do with family members, to bring those things to light and to, you know, save our clients' lives, basically.
Great, thank you. Erica, do you want to go next?
Sure. And James, I'm sorry for calling you John. Let's say sorry. But and also just say I really appreciated your breakdown of critical race theory in the first question. And just kind of, I think, to continue to build off of like what y'all have already said. I think maneuvering the racist criminal justice system, it gives you a little bit of room to just recognize the law won't get us free, and so that it's a tool of white supremacy. But again, as I said, I think if we use it correctly, or if we try to use it, we can use it as a tool to like build power, to mitigate some harm in some ways, and to try to give our communities some space and time to struggle for like a real vision. And then for me, it like helps to counter what we were taught in law school, that we should rely on the legal system to right the wrongs of society. And we're like, oh yeah, I'm a become a elected official, or I'm gonna be a civil rights attorney. And none of those things are wrong, but just recognize that alone is actually not gonna like transform our communities. But it's actually like building people power that will. And I think that it also like delegitimizes, for me, helps articulate that the law is not a function of justice. And so that justice likely cannot happen inside of a courtroom, that it's in like community that will find justice. And so I think in navigating the criminal legal system, I go into it with a different set of like skills and tools to, one, be able to have a conversation with people we're representing or people we're working with to say like, actually the law can only get us so far. And being able to articulate, well, if we win, if we fail in this way, that this is why, and this is what another type of fight looks like. And so, whether that means inviting people into participatory defense, or some type of participatory democracy to counter the failure of the law. I think is the way that I'm like, okay, well, how do we actually address the fact that the justice system cannot actually function as like a moral compass? And I think, again, it's through like being able to articulate that to our communities and democratize the law so that they understand that when we get into these types of battles, that our work exists like both inside and outside of the courtroom.
Great, thank you. So I will now move on to the next question, which is kind of a twofold question. But how have the organizations that you work with, in the past or now, aim to redress the imbalance and give power and agency to the communities that you work with?
I'll go first again because I let Heidi take it first far too many times before. So with BPLS, we've tried to be as on the ground as possible. In the UK, I imagine in the US as well, actually, like the legal system can be really intimidating to anyone who's not used to dealing with it. It's built that way, like that's intentional. We don't need so much Latin in this, industry. Like that's old school. It's made to be. It's there so that the people using it feel powerful, and so that there's ideas that can't instantly be grasped by the kind of lay people in the courtroom. And especially for the Black community in the UK, they don't trust that system. Like, as we've said, the criminal justice system is massively stacked against Black people across the board. And a lot of people will know this from reading this data, maybe even from personal experience or experience of people they know. It's like illustrated in the Lamy Review when he discussed Black people plead guilty far more than white people in court. And some various theories are put across for this. We don't know for certain, but one of the big ones is that they just don't trust their lawyers. If a lawyer comes in and says, right, if you do this, you'll get this plea deal. For people who don't trust the legal system, they're like, well, I probably won't. Like, the court's not going to look kindly on it. I don't trust the court process to go through in the way it should. I know I didn't do the thing, so I'm going to plead not guilty. And that ends up racking up people's sentences, which actually just exacerbates an existing problem. And Black people end up with harsher sentences than white people for exactly the same crimes, partly because of that. So we try and get around with that. The main way we engage with people is either on the ground at protests or through social media. And that's where we get so much of our contact. We get most people who we help out approach us on Twitter and DM us on there. And we're able to direct them towards people, and we're able to make sure that we are taking their requirements on board, listening to what they actually want and what their worries are, and then directing them to people who can actually help. So instead of them having to, when they get in trouble with the police, instead of them having to go to some monolith of a law building or call some number with a person on the other end of the line who doesn't sound anything like them, they can talk to us, and they can meet our legal observers at the protests who can hand them bus cards with our contact details on, or they can DM us on Twitter and chat to us on there. And it means that we basically try and be as grassroots as possible. We want people to be able to approach us as approachable and as easy and as knowing their situation, so they don't feel intimidated in doing so. And it's been tough. I mean, we're a charity. We don't have the budget for mass targeted adverts or anything like that. But I think it's a really important aspect of our work, because people feel comfortable coming to us, and we don't end up as just another law firm that they don't really feel comfortable with.
I'm going to skip myself on this one because I don't actually work with an organization. So I'll let you guys answer.
Cool. So that leaves Erica.
Yeah. I think so. Law for Black Lives, we address this through movement lawyering, participatory democracy, and through working with organizers. And even beyond that, I think throughout the ecosystem, as a movement lawyer, the work is in really practicing movement lawyering and participatory democracy, and working with organizers, we're engaging in political education, leadership development, relationship building, resource disbursement. That means giving people money to participate in cases, and the policy work. And relationship building, I think I already mentioned that, so that folks can be a part of the case, not just the casework, but also join the movement. Because again, for me, I'm we need people to commit to the work if we're gonna have a mass movement and really shift things. And I think the other piece is we want to practice interdependence. So we're not just relying on folks to be plaintiffs, but we want to be relying on folks to inform our strategy and our next steps. And inform what our vision looks like after the conclusion of the case. And I think more broadly, it's that we've been really trying to think about. We had a Law for Black Lives had a CLE, a radical litigation CLE, 2 weeks ago. And the CLE we held was because movement organizers came to us and were well, there are people engaged in litigation around bail, and they're doing it absent community. They're doing absent organizers. So they're oftentimes engaged in litigation, either winning or losing, and our communities are left to deal with whatever the outcome is, to try to figure out what accountability looks like. And I think one way to really address that is to say I don't think that we actually should be engaged in any type of litigation work, any type of policy writing or advocacy, if it is not something that has been called on us by our communities and our movements. Because to do so without that just means that we often come up with faulty solutions. Our analysis is often narrow, because we haven't done the work of consulting with people who are directly impacted. And I mean, even myself, maybe being a directly impacted person, my experience is not the total experience of other people. So for me, I think we just got to push ourselves to be in deeper community with people and be in deeper collaboration with movements and organizations, grassroots organizations, so that we're accountable and our work is driven by folks who are doing the work of talking every day to our people.
Yeah, I think that kind of moves on to the next question. But I feel that particularly in the UK, this concept of movement lawyering is really new. I feel everyone's the social justice lawyer, they're committed to supporting communities, they're a rebellious lawyer, but they're still doing traditional lawyering in terms of keeping the status quo, in terms of client relationship, in terms of not being on the ground in communities. I feel it'd be really nice for you, possibly Erica, to kind of expand, particularly why it's so crucial as a next step to think about movement lawyering and actually not working in silos and giving communities agencies, because a lot of people will take on maybe a class action case, but when they finish the case, as you mentioned, the communities that they worked with, individuals will be in silos and they will be dependent on the lawyer to support them and not being able to have agency themselves. I think it'll be really good to kind of explain, particularly to our UK lawyers, particularly what it is about movement lawyering that makes it so crucial. The next step on looking at ways to show up for Black lives.
Yeah, I think so I know that, like, you know, we're serious about transforming these systems. We're serious about like changing the material conditions of our people, the day-to-day conditions of our people. I think we're serious about winning. And if we are, then I think that for us, we have to recognize that the win cannot happen in isolation with like just one case. And like our theory of change is like organizing. That like it's actually like people who have a particular set of politics working together towards a particular goal. And so it's the work of lawyers to figure out what role we have inside of that. And I just want to name that for us, movement lawyering and I didn't know about movement lawyering in law school. Like I came to it post law school, and I was like, oh, I'm in movement and I'm a lawyer and I want to like do the things combined. And then I like figured out what movement lawyering was, and when I started working with Law for Black Lives. But you know what I know now is just that it has also been like driven by like white men who are not directly impacted, who don't look like me. And so, but for us at Law for Black Lives, we're like, you know, black women, black femme folks. And we're like, oh, actually, and many of the people we're organizing with look like us and have like a particular experience. And so for us, we're oftentimes in rooms where we're like, we're organizing and we're like practicing law, but we're trying to do it in a way that like doesn't re-entrench like these hierarchies where oftentimes we go into a room and like folks are like, oh my God, you're a lawyer, you know all the answers. And it's like, no, I don't. I know a few things that I pay like too much money for, but the strategy and the vision is something we have to create together. I think the other reason we rely on movement lawyering, or like we invest ourselves in movement lawyering, is also because like, and I gave that history too, because like, you know, the first kind of iteration of movement lawyering was absent of a real politics, like real politics. And for us, we're like, oh no, we're real clear. We have politics here. And our politics are like, abolition of the prison industrial complex, Black queer feminism, intersectionality, anti-capitalism. And so that also means like, who do we work with? And what does that work look like? I think is also important because it determines what we advocate for. And you know, we look and we see litigators who like are actually like undermining, like right now, real work that organizers have been doing. When organizers have been saying defund the police, we have lawyers who have been saying that's not possible, or working with like, who call themselves like, you know, progressive lawyers who have been working with city council folks to try to undermine the demand of our movements. And if we're practicing real movement lawyering, then we're in the meetings with our people. We're building the relationships so that we can like figure out how do we make it possible? Not that it's impossible, it's like how do we push the law? Because the law already ain't legitimate, but how do we push it enough to where we can at least give our people time and space to really fight for the vision that they like, that folks are demanding and like know in their hearts to be true and possible.
Thank you. That was such a powerful summary, Erica. I'm feeling even revamped myself. I just want to know if the other panel member wants to add anything on before I move to the next question. I know Erica's done a fabulous job, so I understand if you don't want to, you know, add in on that, it's fine.
Yeah, Erica absolutely crushed that. I can't nothing significant to add to that at all. But the only thing I'd say is that like, yeah, I think BPLS has been really good at that. I think this is a group of people who everyone has the community kind of at their heart. All the steps are kind of geared towards the community. And like, there's just the thing that really brought it to mind for me was like, if they all know this and anyone from the UK is watching, that moment in Mangrove 9 in the Small Axe show, which for our American audience is it's a series of films going on at the moment on TV here. And these guys go into
you can watch on Amazon as well. Small Axe. Yeah. Sorry, James, continue.
Yeah. No, look it up. It's really good. But yeah, there's a bit where they go into the community. They've been arrested basically just for having a Trinidadian restaurant and just for the racist police force that they had in the kind of the 80s. And what makes the big difference is that they have a lawyer who, rather than going for usual courtroom tactics, is listening to their community and does a ton of things that you're not supposed to do in a courtroom, and a ton of things that all the other lawyers are saying, don't do this. And he's like, no, this is what the movement needs. Like, this is like, might be bad for the case, but it's very good for the movement. And I think that just personally, that really pushed it home for me. Erica said it better than the movie did even, but it was still a good illustration for me.
And it was very good for the case because they were found not guilty, and it was just a real space where we saw lawyering communities coming together and the lawyers literally ditching the status quo and actually, you know, being a movement lawyer and being in the movement. And that particular lawyer, Ian McDonald QC, has passed away now. He was so involved, particularly in supporting the Black community, that I've read about 3 or 4 books from different Black activists in different spaces from around the 70s and 80s, and his name is always brought up because he was just so involved in the community. The community knew him, and the community really valued him. And I think, you know, lawyers need to kind of start thinking about how they can be involved in communities and be with the organizers and you know, have a relationship with them, and not just be like, oh, I'm a lawyer, and then just go about their business, but actually seeing how they can actually form relationships that are codependent on each other. So I think that's really powerful. So this is the last question, which is, you know, quite sad for me. Hopefully people in the audience will ask some more questions so we can have the panel on for just a bit longer. But the next question is, do you think this new wave of BLM movement and global uprisings will lead to more collaboration with activists from the UK and the US? You know, because when we look at the 70s and 80s, there's a lot of intergenerational or, you know, transnational work going on, which I'm not really seeing at the moment. So I'm just wanting to see what the panel's views are on this.
I don't necessarily have an answer to that question, except to say that I think it's, you know, with the time that we're living in, with social media, with our ability to do what we're doing today, which kind of blows my mind. I just think it's really cool. And I think also, oddly, because of the pandemic, it's pushed us into doing, you know, things like this, right? Where we're all over the, you know, country and world from each other, but yet here we are collaborating and talking about these issues. I think that it's of the utmost importance on a world scale that we continue to build these types of relationships that we're building today, and keep expanding it. I mean, you know, I think because of the situation that we're in with social media, if you look at what just happened in Nigeria with the uprisings there, also, there's stuff that went on there that we would have never known about were it not for camera phones and social media. And so, you know, we have these amazing tools now that we didn't have, our parents didn't have back in the day. And I think we have a responsibility to keep using them as much as we possibly can to expand this global movement. Because, you know, the reality is there are a lot more of us on this planet than there are of those 1%ers, right? There are billions of us compared to them. And so I think the more that we can continue to collaborate and use these tools and educate each other and ourselves, we're only going to be the better for it. And our I would say our global movement to stop, you know, police brutality and all these other things that are happening is only going to continue to grow. And maybe even perhaps because of the pandemic, pushing us indoors and making us sit on Zoom meetings and doing stuff like this. Maybe it's even going to spur it even more. I don't know. I mean, I've been on more Zoom meetings in my life in the last, you know, 10 months than I ever have been, you know. But I've also been able to learn and experience things and, you know, be in community with people like Erica, who are amazing and doing amazing work. And so, and all of you guys there in the UK. And so I think I'm really hopeful that we will continue to build these bridges, you know, across the globe and continue to build our movement, which, you know, like I said, there's way more of us than there are of them, and they know that. And so we have to use any tactics that we can at our disposal to keep moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really good point, because even the way me and Heidi met was actually we was on a Zoom call together. It was a project that was going in the US, and I was putting some point, you know, about racist policing and just the treatment of Black people, and me and Heidi was going back and forth in the chat, and now we're here because of that exchange. So I think it's testament of actually there's a lot going on, and there's so much ways we can connect, even, you know, across the globe. So yeah, that's really powerful, Heidi. Thank you. Erica, do you want to go next, and then James finishes?
Sure. Yeah, I'm like really excited of like what it looks like to build with activists and organizers from the UK and the US. And like, you know, I think the truth is we saw folks were building in 2014 and 15 across like you know, from the US to like Palestine to like, you know, South Africa. And then I even think about the movement to abolish prisons and police, which, you know, I think the BLM movement is a part of. Folks are building like solidarity and working with each other in different parts of South America and the US, because the truth is like our enemies are like use similar tactics. They are trained by each other. And so I think the freedom that we're fighting for necessitates that we build relationships with each other. And I even think about like, BLM movement, we see it in Canada and like even chapters in Canada and even in the UK, and folks have been building with each other. And so my hope is that we can continue to build with each other. I like want to throw down with y'all. Because I mean, I want to work with y'all. And because we inform each other. So like, because the tactics are so similar and they're the same. And so, and the narrative is similar. And so I think we have to be, practice some type of solidarity and be working with each other, and experimenting with each other. Oftentimes when we look to alternatives to like police and prisons, we do an international search and a scan of work that folks are doing internationally to figure out what's possible. And so it makes sense for us to be in collaboration and to be working with each other.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And I've just hit our group chat for the committee at BPLS, and everyone was like, yes, Erica, we want to work with you. Yeah. So you're in good spirits. And yeah, James, we'd like to answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, I can't follow that up. Like you've really made it difficult for Erica. Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think you've both said the points that I was going to say, which is that like we have the ability, the technology and everything is there. Like we're all used to Zoom by now. It's not difficult for this kind of cross-border communication. And as you say, the problems and stuff are the same all the world over. I think, yeah, the final point I'd say is that, again, like one thing I like doing is looking up the other side's arguments and then kind of knocking them down. And when it came to the kind of UK BLM protests, I remember tons of people that like to call themselves journalists were saying that the UK protests were like pointless or out of place because like this is something that happened in America and the protests here aren't necessary. And I hated that. I hated that people were saying that. And like I think that the key reasons are like, firstly, as you say, like wherever this happens, it's bad. Like this same abuse is going on across the world. Like it's the same as Heidi said with the NSARS killings in Nigeria. We sent legal protesters to those protests as well because that's the same thing happening. The same thing that happened here. It's the police killing people, and wherever it goes on, we need to stop it. Secondly, like not only is it the same thing going on, it's probably like going to spread to here. The thing that really pissed me off with the journalist saying that about George Floyd is like, that can't be the boundary we set up. Like we're not that far off. The Met Police can't say we haven't choked anyone to death in the street and expect a pat on the back for that and like it's all fine. Like this, it's the same thing happening. We just haven't got to that point. And we should be able to show unity in the fight against it because it's still relevant to us. And then, yeah, thirdly, in this specific example, like we're not that far off. The British police have a deeply ingrained institutional racism, and it might not be as overt as America, where I think you guys have police members who are like active KKK members, which is just messed up. But we still have issues. As I said, we still got huge issues of Black people being killed in custody more than white people. We've got Black people having force use against them more than white people. There was something I saw recently in the BBC when they were discussing about Black people having force used against them, and a police officer literally used the phrase that Black people were seen as more threatening and aggressive. And so like the same mindset is here, the same mindset, as you say, it's across the world. It's the same thing we're all fighting. So absolutely, we should be working and putting resources together to deal with it. We have the ability to do it. We've got the motivation, like we've got the reasons to do it. So I don't know, but I definitely hope there'll be more collaboration work. Erica, yeah, I definitely hope we'll be hearing from you more, and Heidi as well. Like we've set this connection up now. Let's make the most of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I would echo you. I remember Leslie Thomas QC was talking about, he's been on cases, inquests, where he's seen the same chokeholds being used against Black bodies. So, we're dealing with the same enemy. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's important to be mindful of that. And yeah, I've really, really enjoyed today's webinar. I'm just literally, it feels like we're all in the same room, even though we're so far apart. And I just really appreciate you all coming today. Oh, we have a question, so I can stay a bit longer. So the question is, what is the panel's opinion surrounding performative activism and the BLM movement?
I mean, so I'm an organizer before I'm a lawyer, and I'm like, if you're performing, there's something there. So for me, I'm like, well, what does the work look like to say, okay, friend, I see you. Let's have like, you want to talk about what you mean here, and can I invite you into an organization? Because I think so much about what we're trying to do here has to be about inviting people into organizations so that they can get the political education they need, or we need, engage in relationship building. And so even when we see that, I'm like, well, if you bout it, I want to invite you in the song, or into BYP 100, or into Law for Black Lives, if that's where you are. So I think that's where I am. It has to go beyond that and into an organization.
Yeah, I agree. Anyone else had any other things they wanted to share about how their opinions around performative activism around the BLM movement?
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Erica said, that like I hate the term virtue signaling, because I think it's used to just paper over people just actually being good people and pretending that it's just some signaling thing. But like, in the same way that you get companies greenwashing and pretending they're eco when they're not, it is obviously really insulting if you get companies pretending they're really into racial equality when they're not. But I still think that first step has to be taken, and that first step is important. So if someone's willing to take that first step, they should develop on it from there. But like, it is great if they take that first step and then do more. But I also think, specifically in this, it's kind of more difficult than the eco bit, and I think there's actually a little bit more respect to be given to people that do it. And again, only if they take the first steps after it. But I think the perfect example is the recent Sainsbury's ad that, again, British audiences will know. And Sainsbury's is like a supermarket here that they basically did a Christmas ad. I haven't even seen it. I've only read the responses. But they did a Christmas advert that included a black family. And oh my God, the vitriol they got. Like, people were posting horrible responses as if showing a black family on TV was like the most un-British thing ever and terrible. And in that moment, like, I decided to shop at Sainsbury's more. Like, that might have been entirely performative, I don't know. But like, the fact that they were willing to get so much anger to do it, I kind of respect that. And I hope they take more steps. I hope it's not just them doing that. Like, this isn't them saying they're kind of clean and dry, but like, if a company is willing to really piss off racists, then I see that as a point in their favor. And so as long as they can follow it up with some good work afterwards, like, I don't really see a problem.
I think just, especially being a white person in this movement, I think it's really important that, we saw a lot of white people come out into the streets and use their voices, and a lot of them actually use their bodies. But I think that it can't stop there, and it can't just be something that, people are going out, oh, I'm going to protest and I'm going to post it online just so that I look like I care. I think that there has to be much more than that. And there has to be, for people that are doing that, a real kind of personal reckoning on, what your motivations are and why you're out doing what you're doing. And to know that it has to go deeper and further than that.
Yeah. I think, really powerful reflections. Definitely with James as well, because even though Sainsbury's put out that ad, we had it in the UK again, Tesco's meant to put out a similar ad with a black family, and they've now actually removed the ad. They've removed the black family from the ad, because they don't want any black backlash. So we're seeing how actually the racist backlash in this country is even policing how supermarkets feel that they have to include black people. They don't want people to stay, they don't want to shop at Sainsbury's. So it's really sad to see how our blackness is still weaponized, and actually we're still dehumanized. If people are feeling so upset that they're seeing black people on their TV, that they would, opt to boycott a shop. But it kind of shows that we have so much more work to do, and it kind of shows us, where things are at. And people think that, oh yeah, BLM, it was all great. No, there's more work to be done, and I think it's always good to have these reminders that there's still work to be done. So yeah, but I think that's it from the questions we're getting. So I just wanted to say to everyone, you know, thank you so much for coming and taking part in this webinar. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I think, you know, you've all brought such valuable points. Just want to again thank you for agreeing to take part, and thank you for just bringing yourselves and, you know, for all the work that you continue to do and have always done as well. So just a big thank you from us here at BPLS for taking part in our first ever webinar. And this is the start of us continuing to have this conversation where we are organizing transnationally and doing this the work that needs to be done.
Thank you so much for having us. Peace
out. Thanks for having us very much.
No problem.
Yeah, cheers, guys. It's been great.
Great. And then we've got some lot of feedback. People saying they had really good food for thought and they've learned quite a few things. So yes, thank you.